All right, so now that the microphone seems to be doing what it's supposed to be doing, we are going to cover Flask this week along with setting up the application. There is a tutorial out here. You can find it in this week's section. You click on the tutorial and we'll go ahead and get started. So to get started, you guys can go ahead and create a new project out here on your GitHub. I'm gonna go ahead and sign into mine. As I mentioned just a minute ago before the thing wasn't working correctly, I would give it a name, but I would not call it Mini Project 3 just yet, as you guys are going to be doing similar code, but probably not the exact same code for this. So what I typically called it was Flask tutorial. This is a Flask project example. You can call it whatever. So we would go to new, just to kind of refresh from what we've done in the past. Here, we're going to call this our Flask tutorial. Sounds good to me. Go ahead and add us a README so we get started. We want to get ignore template for Python. License, we'll go ahead and leave blank. Create that repository. And then from here, because now we have the code, we can go to code and copy this. We'll pull up our PyCharm. We'll close out anything you had open prior to that. And let's see here. So close project. And we would get from VCS, plug in that URL, see if it clones out here. Nice, Steve. All right. So now that we've got that cloned out from our GitHub, everything's linked up on that side. We do need to create a Python interpreter down here at the bottom because we're starting a new project. So we'll click down here, go to add new interpreter, local interpreter, and you would just leave this as the basics. You don't have to change anything. Just hit OK. And that should get us a new Python environment for our tutorial.
You make your screen bigger.
Yep. So view. That work? Of course. Let's try it again. There we go. All right. So just like with every project, we double check that Python down here in the lower is set to the name of our project so that we know we have our right interpreter. We should have a README file that's just there by default. We should have a get ignore. Go ahead and double click on your get ignore, scroll down to the very bottom and make sure that you uncomment out idea so that it doesn't keep all the PyCharm stuff. Yeah, you just click on this down here at the bottom and then add new interpreter, local interpreter, and just hit OK. No, you're good. It's been a little bit since we poked around in here. All right, if all this went well and get ignores change, you should notice get ignore went blue. And in our README, just for our own purposes, we'll say the Flask tutorial. And then we can just have text here that would say this will follow the tutorial, I don't know, and we could just throw in that URL so that you guys have something here to remind yourself what you're doing. So just grab this tutorial, and this should be the latest and greatest one. 3x, yes. And so on the old videos and such, you may not have It may have been using a prior version, so you'll want to make sure to use this year's one as kind of a tutorial. As they update stuff, you don't want to use the old stuff because otherwise when you go to check out files and stuff, it won't match up. So make sure you're using 3.0 for this year. Okay, once you've got that, let's go ahead and commit those little changes so we can make sure that GitHub's up and running. We'll just say updated README and git ignore for starting tutorial. Okay, oops, if I spelled that correctly, there we go. Commit and push, make sure everything actually goes up like we would hope. And then push. And then I'll pause here and let you guys get caught up. I'll pause the recording. Okay, now that we got everything committed and pushed and we're good on that portion of it, let's go back to our tutorial. Now, again, I like to use their tutorial, both Flask and Django, because they do a really good job of breaking down the individual pieces you guys need. In the past, I came up with example projects and such, and then I found out nothing really beats their own tutorials. They do a really good job in that. So the tutorial that we're going to walk through is going to help us build that basic Flask application, which is a blog website. And it will allow people to register, log in, create posts, edit posts, delete their own posts, etc. And you'll be able to install this and you can run it on any computer that has a web browser up and running. And you can kind of see some examples of this. So you'll have a login screen that looks a little something like this. You'll be able to have them edit and create a post section, hit save, and it would be able for anybody to go ahead and view. Down at the bottom, you will see that they have example code down here. So you could pull their code off GitHub to kind of use it as a reference if you need it along the way. All right. So we're going to continue to project layout. And to get started, we're going to go into our project, which we have this called Flask tutorial here. And our project is going to be whatever you called it. So like here, I called it Flask tutorial, but I did a little different spelling. So we'll have to follow some slightly different instructions for that piece. But basically, we pull up terminal. And remember, when you pull up terminal, you want to make sure that over here on the left, you have your VNV. Then make sure that you have your Python environment all set up, ready to go. So inside the tutorial, we already have this because we're using PyCharm in the background. If you guys were just using raw Python and no editor, then you would follow those steps. We don't need to do that. All right. If we come down below here, the Flask application is basically a single file. That's what's really nice about Flask. It starts as a single file. You'll have additional files along the way, but your main file, the file that actually runs the program, is a real simple task. And so we're going to call it hello.py to get started. So let's go ahead and do hello.py. We come up here to the main tutorial page, right click, new Python file. And we're going to call it hello. And we will add that to our Git repository. And that should give us a green hello py file over here on the left. And then out here in the middle, we can go ahead and just copy and paste in this code from the tutorial. And it will look like, come on. There we go. So from Flask, import Flask. So we're going to need to pip install Flask module to get that going. We're going to use the main Flask object inside that package. App allows us to set the name. And so this just uses whatever the file name is, Flask tutorial, the folder name as the name of our project. And we set up app routes. So you guys have been to websites, right? You know that the home directory is just the slash, right? So this is the route for if anybody wants to go to slash, we run the function called def hello. And in that, we just return hello world. Super, super simple on that side. So to get that up and going, we're going to have to obviously do some instructions there. As this project will get bigger, you're going to have a whole lot of files instead of just one file. So at the end of the tutorial, this will be your folder structure and tree as it goes out. All right. Lots of different folders and files and things that we're going to build out. We are using version control on this side, so you're going to see things like our get ignore. You can see all of these ones built out. We already set up this get ignore, so we don't need to do that. It's part of our PyCharm setup. All right, so we are going to go ahead and click on application setup and go on to the next step. All right. And so again, if we go back, I'm going to go back one step here just so you can look at our folder structure. So we have this overall Flask tutorial. We have a Flask.r file folder, right? And then we have our init.py that's underneath of that. We have an auth, a blog. Those are the ones we're going to start on. So what we want to do over here is we created this hello.py. We're not actually going to use this file inside of our project, so we can go ahead and delete it. It's just there for you guys to figure out how to make sure everything's working. So for us, what we want to do is go up here, or down here rather, and do a pip install Flask. And notice Flask has a capital F.
Does it break anything if you do a lowercase f? Because I never lowercase f.
It should still find it. Technically, it actually should be a lowercase f now that I think about it. Same thing. Should pull. You'll notice you'll get some extra packages in here. So one of them is called markup safe. All your HTML files or anything you build up, it's going to be in markup format, which is exactly like your README files. And so this makes sure that whatever you're typing in is safe code to run on a web server. Same way with It's Dangerous is going to double check and make sure you're not trying to break into SQL databases, things like that. It's just a way of fixing stuff. Colorama, Blinker, Wurzburg here is going to be for your security on the website. So if you guys want to do SSL, if you're going to encrypt passwords, things like that. Jenga 2 is what we're going to use for our templating system. Click, and then our, of course, main Flask system. So once this all gets done, you guys will remember from your other projects, we will do a pip freeze greater than, and then requirements.text. And that will make sure we have all of our packages sent out to our requirements file. We can go ahead and right click on our requirements file, go to get and add. So now that should be green. And then we have our hello file. We can go ahead and just take our file and make sure it actually runs. So I'm going to move this off to the side here. We'll hit run file. And if all goes well, it will start a Flask application, and all went up. It says it's processed. Everything did what it's supposed to do. At this point, it doesn't really do anything on the screen because we haven't really set up anything to run on that side. All right. So we go back to hello, hit run, and we should be good. Okay. So this hello file, we can go ahead and trash it. All that is to test and make sure Flask is importing correctly. That's all it's doing. It worked because we got no errors down here, so we're good. We can delete it. And we're going to real quick just do a commit and say that we created requirements.text. That way we have an instance of this. Just like in your other projects, the more commits you do, the happier you'll be with yourself, especially when you're running this tutorial, because when you blow it up, you can always revert back to a version that was working just fine. If you do big chunks in between, you're going to be mad because you have to recode a bunch of stuff. Okay, so we should have our requirements.text. That all looks good. Now we can go ahead and start in on this application setup. So to do that, we need to create a Flask.r folder, and underneath of that, we're going to serve that up. So let's click up here at Flask tutorial, right click, new, directory, and it's going to be called Flask.r. Okay, that's the name of our blog application we're creating. And then we need to create an init.py. What that does is when we call the Flask.r app, it automatically runs this code so that it's set up. We just tell it to run our Flask.r app. So we need to create an init.py underneath of that folder. So we click on our folder, right click, new Python file. It will be 2 underscores, init, 2 underscores, and then press enter. Again, what the init file does is when you call this folder as a module, it will immediately run the code that's written in the init folder. It's the initialization script, so to speak. We can go back to our code, and we're going to copy and paste all of this into that file. Okay. All right, so if we take a look at this, what it's going to do is create our application, right? We're going to give it the name, is the name of our folder. That looks good. Our secret key is set to dev. You guys would obviously tweak this over time. Our database is where we're going to create a file called flaskr.sqlite. You guys have probably played with some other databases over time, whether it was MySQL, Mongo, what's the other ones you guys have played with? As long as you don't mention Oracle, we're okay, right? So there's a bunch of other database types. Flask supports multiple of those out there. The beauty of SQLite is it's just a flat file. You guys don't have to run a full-blown database server on top of your application. This just runs off a simple file. When you guys are doing really small web applications or dev or test like you're doing in here, SQLite's going to be perfect for that. All right. It then has the option to say if test config is none, meaning that from our web or our folder, if test config is set to none, then we go ahead and pull our config.py. If it's not, then we're going to go ahead and use a special code. The reason for this or something like this is so that we can set it up for development. We can also set it up for production. Make sense? So we may have options in development, like we don't need fancy keys and special password checkers and all this other stuff. But when we get to production, we kind of want to make sure that stuff's in play. Or we're doing development with SQLite because it's a simple file on our laptop. However, if we're going to put this where 1,000 people are going to start playing with our blog application, we should probably have a real SQL server sitting underneath the hood, not SQLite. Okay. This last one underneath is going to make sure that we have the folders that are needed for this. If not, go ahead and make those using the OS make DIRs folder. You guys did this back in Python 360. And then at the very end here, we're going to have a very simple page that just has hello written on it. And so again, this one has an app route of /hello. So if we go to the main website, nothing's going to show up. We have to go to /hello. And in this case, we're going to simply just print hello world up to the screen. From there, we'll go ahead and return that app and we'll be good to go. Okay. If we look back here, they're going to give you the same explanation of the stuff that I was just talking about. There's going to be a little more detail there, so feel free to read through that. To run your application, you would, from the command line, run, and we'll open up a terminal here. We'll run this command. Flask --app Flaskr, that's the name of this folder that we created. Run, and then --debug is going to give us a bunch of debug information so we can see what's all going on in the backside. So if we go ahead and run that, what that does is basically create you your own web server that's running locally on your machine. It's going to be tied to 127.0.0.1. Anybody know what that is from you networking guys? What does 127.0.0.1 refer to? Your local host, it's just your local machine. That's a built-in IP address that doesn't route anywhere. It's just your local whatever you're working on. And on port 5000, all right? So if you click on this link, which is handy inside PyCharm, it will launch a web browser for you and take you out to your newfound website, okay? You'll find it says not found. All right, that's because we have to go to /hello, and at /hello, we got a real fancy website that says hello world. Okay, it's a super simple way of using Python to build websites really, really fast. All right, now this is just a development web server. We're not running Nginx or Apache or all these other big web servers in order to front it. This is just for development purposes. Okay. If you look down here at the bottom, you're going to see that debugger is active. Here's a pin code. If we were to use the debugger, it asks for a pin code. We just plug and copy that in. We can also see down here at the bottom that somebody requested the main website. It was us, right? We also see that they requested the /hello. When they asked for the main website, we gave them a 404 error. Does anybody remember what 404 is? Not found, right? And we saw that on our screen, right? If we go back and look at our main / we got a not found error, okay? When we called for asking for /hello, we again see that down here, we got a 200. 200, if you guys remember from our API stuff, means status okay. All right, so this is a great way to kind of test what's going on with your website as we're working on it and flying with it. Okay. Again, as it's reminding you here, this is just a development server. You would not use this in production. You actually need some kind of WYSIWYG server up above it, which can handle multiple threads, people running on it, that kind of stuff. Dev works perfect. Okay. So we're up and running to the races. If you already have another program running on port 5000, you're going to get some kind of OS error. Basically, this means you have it running in somewhere on your computer. You might have two terminal windows open and you forgot to close one. That's where you would get that kind of error. All right. Anybody have any questions on this part so far? All right, nothing fancy. All we're doing is getting the basic framework plugged in. Then we start making some changes along the way. Yeah.
Might break if you, so obviously you have to go to /hello, you can just make it like the main page, can it break, or do you have that with the /?
In this case, because we set up the route to be /hello, you would have to go there. If you took this out and just have the / page and then reload your website, which it will automatically do, by the way, it's kind of cool. You don't have to save and reload and do all that. It already detected there was a change. We can go back out to the website, go here. If we refresh on hello, now we get the 404. If we take out hello, it's now the main website. So it's very, very simple to build out multiple pages. You just say down here in your app route /blah, and then whatever you wanted to do during you going to that website. Yep. Yep. And that's all we're going to do is we're going to build all these different routes of register, right? And this is my registration page. And then I want it to render. So for now, it's just displaying simple text on the screen. We will actually want to do full HTML, and that's where we'll use Jenga templates and things like that. But at its very basic level, dump it right here. Now you can notice this is just a return, right? So I could even have this immediately connect out to my API, grab the information I want, just do a print statement. It prints it on, you know, if I return that string, it just dumps it right there on the website. Now, all of a sudden you have a GUI to whatever you guys have been doing for the last 4 weeks, 8 weeks, right? It's very simple. Somebody goes to a website, go to this URL, boom, they see your data. All right. So let's go ahead and just save this. And by save, I mean just do a git push. We're going to say that we created blog app and hit commit and push. Again, every time you do these little chunks, it sounds like a lot, but when you guys get to your final project, I've had so many people do that. They try to do too big of a chunk. They completely screw up their code and they're trying to revert back and they lose 2 weeks worth of work. You don't want to lose 2 weeks worth of work. So, all right. So the next step is we need to set up a database in order for us to store information in. So you guys are used to storing things in lists or dictionaries, etc. If we use a database, it's extremely fast. Plus, there's a lot of nuances and some abilities to pull it from a database that it can store information quickly. You can do groupings, you can do all sorts of stuff that you would have to write code for in Python to do with lists and dictionaries. So in our case, we need to create a db.py file. So let's go into our project. And in the same directory, we have this init.py. We're going to click on Flask-R up here, right click on it, new Python file. We're going to call it db, hit enter. We'll add that to our Git repository. Should give us a green db file up here up above. Then come back here and copy and paste all of this code out. and then we'll take a quick look at this stuff. So we are importing SQLite 3. This is the Python package that allows us to interact with the SQLite database. Again, the SQLite database is just a simple file on our machine that's stored in database format. We have a function here called getDB, and it basically says if DB not in G, G is just a special thing for us to set up and connect. This will set up the connection to our database file. So SQLite3.connect, current app is config database, whatever we set up in our config file, and then set it up. And then row factory allows us to pull a row out of a SQLite database. You can think of a SQLite database a lot like an Excel file, right? It's got your rows and columns, and we're going to be pulling headers and things out of that as well. When you connect to a database like this on the getDB, you also have to have a closed connection to that database. Every time you connect, you want to connect to the database, pull information, close the connection to the database. You don't want to leave that open, because if your computer crashes or your server crashes because you coded something wrong, it can corrupt the data in the database because you left a connection open to it. So you always connect to it, gather information, immediately close that connection to the database. All right, that's our two functions in there thus far. Again, this is going to create some explanation to you. Now, to design our database, and this is what is probably the quote hardest part, is you got to figure out how you want to lay out your database and what you would want to store information about. All right. So if we think about a blog website, we have a user section and we have posts, right? So if we look at this schema, let's go ahead and create this schema file, in which case we come back out here to our tutorial, go to Flask, new, and we are going to call it a SQL file down here at the bottom. And that SQL file is called schema.sql. So we call it schema. Hit enter. And we will add this up here as well. And then from that SQL file, we will go ahead and copy and paste the SQL in. We'll talk a little bit about that. Okay, so it comes through here and it says, hey, guess what? I think you're using SQLite. We are using SQLite, so go ahead and tell PyCharm that we are using SQLite. And then it says, hey, configure a data source for this. We're going to leave this blank for now. We will tie it to a file once it creates one. Right now, our Python project has not created the SQL database. What's nice about PyCharm is it will actually go into the SQL file and allow you to look at it like it's Excel so that you can then write the code in Python to pull the data out. So inside your SQL tables, you have what are called tables, all right? And those tables are going to have your rows, columns. Again, it's just like Excel. In this case, we're going to create a table for our users, and those are going to have the fields of ID, username, and password. We're going to create a table for our posts, and those posts are going to have an ID, an author ID, a created timestamp, a title, and a body. And then it's also going to reference back to whatever user made that post. Okay. So if we look closely at this on the user one, we have an ID. This is going to be some integer. And in a database, we call it a primary key. That means if I'm a user Jason, I'm the one user in the database. Number one, I only have to reference one in the database. It will do a lookup and find out that that's Jay Zeller or whatever we decide to call it. We tell it to auto increment this ID so that the next user we create, they get ID 2, then ID 3, ID 4, etc. On the username, we say that this is text information. It is unique, meaning that we cannot have the same usernames. People can't sign up with the same username. This is putting in that restriction. And not null means that we cannot set a username like we require having a username, right? It has to be something. For the password, we are going to store this in plain text. It's not great. Cybersecurity and me is screaming, but we're here for now, right? And that this one is also set to not null. It can't be an empty password. It has to be something. Right? For a post, we're going to have something on the ID that's very similar to what we had before. Author ID is going to be some integer, not null. We're going to have it created. This is a timestamp. So at the moment they hit submit, it takes a current timestamp and stores it in the database. This allows us later on to filter all the posts that came from Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, etc. We have to have the title of our post and then the body of the text itself, right? Again, neither one of those can be null. And then we do what's called a foreign key for this author ID that ties back to this user up above. So if I'm logged in as Jay Zeller, I create a post. I immediately make sure that it is auth ID 1 going back to this table. That way, if I change my username, it doesn't matter, right? It's tied back to the ID, not to the username or to my password. Does everybody get why we're referencing that in that way? Database design in this class is pretty huge, especially when you guys get into Django. The cool thing about Django is that this is a whole lot easier and makes a lot more sense. But in Flask, you guys are using the basic low-level stuff, so you kind of have to understand I'm using text, not integer. I don't want this to be null, like I need an actual answer when somebody types something in, that kind of stuff.
Also, is it gonna matter if it didn't ask me that you're using SQLite, or does it just?
No. It just, all that is later on, if we want to connect to the database and pull it up, it'll connect. We'll tell it here at the end when we're done. Okay, so this is our quote schema for our database. Super simple. We have users, we have posts. All right. Now we need to tell our DB file on how to initialize this database and create that database if it doesn't already exist. So we're going to copy and paste this code, and this will go at the bottom of our db.py file down here. And so we have two new functions. One's called init.d or init_db, in which case this calls getDB, the one we had up here up above. And it's going to use the schema file we just created and be able to execute that using UTF-8. AKA, these are commands that if I logged into a SQL server, I would use these commands in order to create the database schema. Because we wrote it in here, our Python file connects to our database server, executes those commands, and creates the database for us. Then down here at the bottom, we have the initdb command, which is what we would use on our Python terminal, right? We said run Flask earlier. If we use the word initdb, that's what this click command is. At that point, it will wipe the database, clear every existing table, and start us over fresh. Okay. We are using this click package, which is just a terminal way for us to get some feedback as to what's going on, so you guys don't have to code all the different lines. We're using a third-party package to just say, yep, we coded it, we initialized the database, we're good to go. All right. So once that's all good, now we can go down here and look at our register application. And what this is wanting us to do is init our database and make sure that we register that database with our app. So we're going to copy this section here. We're going to paste that at the end of our DB file. And what that function will do, make sure I give it enough space here so it doesn't complain, is we are just creating a CLI command that allows us to call initdb, and that we have a teardown, aka when this application ends, call the close DB function so we don't leave the connector open to that file. All right. Let's look up here. We got getDB, initdb, close DB, init app, and initdb. Okay. Now, down at the bottom of our init file, we need to add code that allows us to access that database. So we're going to copy this, and we're going to go over to our init file. And this is the way the tutorial's written. So we look at this and we see we already have a create AP, right? If I copy this in, it says AP equals ... That's all this stuff. What we want to do is at the very bottom of that code, just copy and paste this little part. So we're going to copy and paste that little part and add it down here at the very bottom of return app. Just before return app, we would paste that in. Make sense? So this is really what we're copy and pasting in this file that already existed for us. We would remove all of this up here. So I'll start over here so it makes more sense, because this is the way the tutorial will do it. It will say, go to your init file. This is the spot in the code I want you to copy and paste it in. So it says app, all this existing code is omitted. I want you just to copy and paste this right before the return app. So if we go back here and look, all I did was add these 2 lines down below the /hello that we had before. Some people get confused and just copy and paste the whole thing in, and then you got 2 files named. You don't want that. All right. So all this does is at the bottom, it says from.import DB, aka import our database. And then we're going to initialize our database when you run this application. It's pretty simple. Now, back on our command line, because we have everything all structured, we can go back to our terminal, which we have here. Let's go ahead and hit Control-C to stop our terminal server from running, right? Hit the up arrow, and you'll see you have your Flask --app, Flaskr run debug, right? We want to replace the run debug with our new command we just created, which is called init-db. What that does is run that Python script that we just did, which will create us a database file. If everything worked, over here on the left, you click, again, click, come on. You should get a file here. Nope, cancel, don't do that. Let me refresh. What's that? Oh, yes, it puts it under instance. You're correct. So you'll notice that there's an instance folder now, and then it's called Flask SQLite. Okay. If we double click that file, over here, it's going to say this is how we would connect to that database. We would hit test connection down here. And this is going to try to connect with that SQLite that we mapped before. If you don't have it, you would come in here and say use SQLite for that portion. Okay. It should give you a check mark, which means we can go ahead and connect to it. Yeah.
Don't need to download driver.
Yeah. So in this case, I need to update mine. So go ahead and download it or update, depending on your system. And then once you download the latest driver, go ahead and test your connection. Again, make sure that this is giving you a check mark. Okay. What this is doing is creating a driver to connect to your database server. Again, in this case, it's just a file called flaskr.sqlite. Okay. If that all works, hit apply, hit OK. And now over here on the right-hand side, you have this database tab. If you click on this arrow here and under main, you will see tables, and you will see the 2 that we created, post and user. These 2 are built into the database itself. We don't worry about those 2. But if we come into our user table, we'll notice we have 3 columns of the ones that we created. Go away. Come on. Cancel. Go away. Stop it. There we go. We have our ID, we have our username and password. We also see that they're set up as integers, text files, etc. We have keys and indexes. You guys pretty much won't use these 2. What this allows you to do is just look at your database structure and make sure it's set up correctly. All right. Later down the road, it will allow you to pull information out of there and then write it in Python. But for now, this is just a quick way to go look through your database. So if we look at this and I double click, you'll notice nothing over here because we have nothing inside of that database file right now. Later, we'll add stuff in there, but for now we don't. Same way with post, we can look at post and we can see that there's nothing in that table at this point. But this allows us to filter, to sort, grab information out of this database as we build it up. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and close this by just clicking on this tab. That'll close the database section. We're going to close this post, user, our SQLite folder, get ignore, and our console. Should just leave us with pretty much init and DB at this point. Clean things up a little bit. Now, if you'll notice over here on the left, instance and this flaskr.sqlite. Does anybody remember what gold means for those?
It won't be uploaded.
Exactly. Those are in our get ignore file. So therefore, they're not going to be uploaded to GitHub, which we would not want. We don't want our data going to GitHub. We just want our structure of how to build this app so that when somebody checks out our application, they start with a clean database for themselves, right? If you wanted something to auto-populate in there, that's a little different. We would create a schema file that would auto add that stuff to the database for us. Okay. Before we click out here and do blueprints, we should probably go ahead and do a git push. So git commit. And in this case, we're going to say set up the database and do a commit push. You can go ahead and push. Again, most of this is just setting up the framework. So you guys will be able to copy and paste and reuse this code. All right. Okay, all looks good in here. Let's go on to blueprints and views. This class goes till 2:45. Okay, so that's good. We'll get through blueprints and views today. All right. So before, what you guys have done is just done a return and it prints it out on the screen, right? And so what we're going to have now is called blueprints and views. A view function is the code that you want to write responding to requests in your application. So if I have it create a login service, I need it to check to make sure that the login is valid, right? Those are called views. Flask is going to use patterns to match those incoming request URLs to some view that should handle the code that's associated with that website, or that web page rather. That view is going to return data to Flask, which will then turn it into some outgoing response, maybe in HTML and maybe just hello world, like what we currently have on the screen, something in that. Flask can also go the other direction and end up generating a URL to a view based on the name and the arguments of everything you pass to it. A blueprint is just a way for us to group related views. All right. So it's just a way for us to create a single file that deals with just this part of our project. So the first example it's going to give you is we're going to create a blueprint for authentication, and we're going to create a blueprint for our blog posts. In other words, let's do all the authentication stuff in this file. Let's do all the actual blog post stuff in this file. Helps keep it organized over time. You guys remember this from 360 in your final project. We started to do the same thing, right? If it was a bunch of functions, we put it over here. If it was something else, we made our main code run in a separate file. So to get started, we need to create this auth.py file. So let's come up here to our Flaskr project, right click, new Python file, and this will be called auth. And again, the whole goal is to keep all of our authentication stuff in here. Makes it much easier when you guys get into really big projects. The more files, the better organization. You guys know where to go. So in this auth file, we're going to copy this initial setup stuff in here. And so from this point, what we're doing is setting up func tools. We haven't used that yet. We'll talk about it a little bit. But from our Flask project, we're going to be setting up our blueprints. And we're saying that this blueprint is called auth, and it's at the URL prefix /auth. So from here on out, we're going to have our 127.0.0.1 /auth, and then everything under this will be after that. So /register, /login, /whatever. Everything falls under that /auth section. And you guys have seen websites built this way, right? You go out, you click on login, it's under some other chunk or something like that in between. Okay. So we set up this blueprint as an overview. And then down here in our init program, we need to add a couple more lines. So we're going to copy just these two lines, the from dot import auth, app register, our blueprint. We're going to copy these two lines. This will go into our init code. So let's go into our init.py, scroll all the way down. And after this init app, we're going to add this part in here to init auth. So this from .import db, what this does is say from the current directory, import db, we have this db file, then it makes those modules available to this program. You guys did the same thing in 360. Yeah.
So would it do anything different if you don't put it at the bottom?
It will, because remember, Python does this all in order. So it would not necessarily import this before it returns the app. As we get going, it will cause some chaos as we go through there. Because up here, it wants to make sure that the app is actually registered and it's referencing this app variable. Down here, we're referencing, you know what I mean? So if you put this at the top, it wouldn't know what the heck app is. So, same way with auth, we now just created this auth file. We're just simply importing that in at this point. Okay, so now we want to create our first view. And that first view is our registration site, AKA we need people to sign up. We don't have to worry about them logging in or signing out yet because we don't even have a place for them to register. So inside of our auth.py, we need to create this registration route. We'll just copy all of this here. Go into our auth.py and paste that in there. Okay. So you'll notice here, because this is now a blueprint, we have at bp.route, and you'll notice we have /register. So now this new prefix is going to be 127.0.0.1/auth/register. We are going to allow us to do both get and posts on this website, right? Because they would get an initial website, they would have a form for them to fill out. When they hit submit, then it would be a post to this website, in which case we need to store the information in the database. Everybody see how that works? Cool. This will all make more sense here once you get past this part and actually see it, right? So in this def register, the first thing you always want to check for is, are they submitting information to us? Okay, so the first thing you should see is if request method is post, do this stuff, else go do something else, right? In this case, we say, if they are not sending information to us, then go ahead and send them the HTML file that they requested. If they are sending us data, okay, they filled out the form. Now we want to go ahead and crunch the data that they submitted to us. So now below that, we are setting up a variable name called username, and we're going to pull that out of the form that they submitted to us. Same way with password. We're going to go ahead and access our database. If we get an error, then go ahead and put the error on the screen. If we don't get an error, then we continue on. If they did not provide us a username in the form, we're going to go ahead and create an error called username is required. If they didn't give us a password, we're going to say password's required. It's a very basic way of saying you either submitted this stuff to us or you didn't. Everybody get that? Cool. If error is none, AKA we didn't have any errors from the username and password, then we're going to go ahead and try to execute into the database. We're going to run the SQL command, insert into user, which is our user table, the username, password with the value of whatever came out of the form from the website, right? Now notice you have a function here called generate password hash, and then we're going to put whatever password in they typed in the website. So this website is clear text, right? They type in a password, it's going to put it on the screen. We hit submit. We send that to our unsecure web server. We're going to take that password. We're going to create a hash for it, store it in the database. That way, if somebody was to hack into our database, they don't see the generated they don't see the password. They see a hash of the password. We never want to store clear text passwords. Cybersecurity world, that's like a giant no-no. Okay. So this function called generate password hash, that's coming from that WorkSog security package that was installed. Okay. Then we're going to do a DB execute, insert all that information. Then we say DB commit. The way database servers are is you send information to it. It is not valid until you actually commit it to the database. So you guys have played with configuration files and Cisco equipment or Palo Altos with me and firewalls and stuff, same concept. You type the commands in, it isn't valid till we actually hit commit and execute it. It's going to try to do that stuff. If there's any kind of integrity error in the database, for example, we said that the username had to be unique, right? So if it tries to commit that username to the database and it already matches the username in the database, it's going to come back and say that user is already registered in the system, and it's going to kick them back out to redirect to fill out the form again. Okay. If all goes well and this executed just the way it was supposed to, then it's going to go ahead and redirect them to the URL for logging in. If anything had issues, we're going to go ahead and flash the error on the screen. And again, we're going to render this HTML document for them to actually fill out the form up above. Anybody have any question on this part here? This part here is called a view inside Flask. In other words, this is a page. This is the logic that happens when they do something on that page. So when they first request the page, all it's doing is saying render that HTML template. When they fill out the template and hit submit, it's going back to this page, only this time it's a post. Now we're going to take the information out of their form. We're going to sanitize it, make sure that it's valid input. If it's valid, dump it into the database, and then go ahead and return them back to the login screen for them to be able to log in. Simple, but lots of moving parts, right? You have to tell it how to do all this stuff. All right. When we scroll down here, again, this is going to tell you everything I just told you in the same format. We need to create a login view for them to actually be able to log into. So let's copy and paste this code. And we're going to put this in auth just below our register. And you'll notice that login looks very, very similar to register in that we go to a /login, we have a get and post here. If they're first coming to this web page, we're going to go ahead and just render out this website called login.html. If not, we're going to go ahead and collect the username and password they use to log in. We'll create a connection to our database. We're going to try to select the user where the username matches whatever they typed in. And we're going to fetch only the first instance. That's why we're using fetch one here. Okay. In theory, there should only be one, right? We should only have one instance of some place where user has this username that we typed in. If user equals none, that means that that was an incorrect username. There's nobody with that name in the database. If we got a user, we need to use the check password hash to take the password they typed in and the password that is in the database and see if those two hashes match one another. Make sense? So we're not going to change their password. We're not checking the clear text. We're actually taking whatever they typed in, hashing it, go back in the database and see if those two hashes match one another. If it doesn't, we say incorrect password. If there is no errors that happens here, we're going to set up our session. And you guys have all seen session cookies when you browse the internet, right? You guys log in on a website, it creates a little cookie on your computer that says, I am this username, here's my user ID on your system, that kind of information, right? You guys have all seen the little pop-up at the bottom of a website that it says allow cookies or all that. That is literally this. We're creating a session cookie. That way, anywhere on our website, all we have to do is look up the cookie and see what their user ID is. We don't have to guess what user's logged in. That's the whole purpose of a cookie on a website. I log into walmart.com. It creates a session cookie that says I'm Jason Zeller. Then when I pull it up and it looks in their system, it's going to use that cookie to look up who I am in that system. It'll also tweak my page that's presented to me based on who I am, right? So if I have login settings to where Jason Zeller wants to make sure that he sees all the electronics first and not the baby diapers, he can be hopeful in his life that at some point he'll be able to play with the tech toys and not baby diapers. All right. So If all works, then we're going to go ahead and send it out to the URL and we'll come back there. All right. This one again is going to explain that. The next thing we need to do in our auth is to create a place for them to log in, right? So we stored that session cookie, and what we want to do is check to see if that user's already logged into our system. If they're already logged in, we can return and say, hey, you're already logged in. What that will also do is not display that portion because they're already logged into your system. So we just simply come down here, add this function called load logged in user. What this does is go to our session, grab that user ID, set that in here so that we can execute and pull all the information out of the database associated with that user. All right. Last piece we got to do, we created our registration page. We created our login page, our login views, by the way. And then we are now needing to create our logout view. All this does is basically clear that session cookie out. So we're going to copy and paste this one, stick it down here at the bottom of our app page. And again, this route just means when we go to /logout, take all of our cookies and trash them. Send us back to the main page. Very simple website. We don't even need a website for it, an actual HTML file. Really, all it's going to do is run some Python code in the background, send us back to the homepage. So at the top of our website, we would have something like login, logout. When we click logout, it's going to go ahead and clear the session cookie, kick us back to the main page. Lots of glue, lots of moving parts at this point. All right. If we want to make sure that we only show pages to people that are logged in, we would want to use a function called login required. So if they're trying to look at posts, but they're not logged in as a user, we don't want them to be able to edit people's posts unless it's their posts. So we're going to have this function that says, are they logged in? And if they're not, then we're going to kick them back to login. So let's add that to the bottom of our auth page. Again, very simple function that allows us to check to see if they're actually authenticated and logged in. Now, down here at the bottom, you'll see all these URL for auth.login. We need to create a file that allows us to point where these things are, right, in our directory structure. And that will be our endpoints for all those. We will set that up with our templates. And you'll notice over here, let's go back and look at this. You'll say URL for auth login. What this is going to be code for us to go look up in a file and see what HTML file we should spit back to the user. For up here, we say render this actual template, right? In this one, we render the actual template. Here, we do a redirect and say, go find with the URL for logging in and send them to the login, AKA send them down to this function, right? So we'll need to create a new file. At this point, that's where we'll close for today. You guys basically have just set up all the views for auth. We can't run it because we don't have any HTML files at this point. So we will just commit all of our changes so that you guys can pick up from here. Inside this section, we'll say set up all auth views and blueprint. Commit and push. And hopefully it pushes. All right. That's a lot of information in a short amount of time. All right. Basically get through this portion of the tutorial so you're good to go on Thursday. Thursday, we'll pick back up off the tutorial and keep moving. All of this will start to make more sense once we get the GUI form of it, right? You just have to write the back end to make the GUI do what you want it to do. In this case, we're building simple websites, simple web applications. So when we come back on Thursday, we'll start up with templates. And this is the HTML code that you guys are used to, where, you know, you set up your lists and your navs and your titles and all the other stuff. We're going to set up all those places in here. Now, when you want to get fancy with these, this is where ChatGPT rolls in, right? You guys say, hey, I'm using this templating system. I want to create a button widget to do this. You tell ChatGPT to build that code out for you and you dump it in there. I'm not asking you to be HTML experts. You're not in web development, right? Some of you are, but you guys are trying to use this for, say, cybersecurity. I don't need you to know that HTML. In theory, you should know it because that's a way for us to break it and hack into somebody else's stuff, but this is a basic. All right, we're saved. I'm going to store this video and I will post this video out there to replace the one from last year. I'm going to move the old stuff into the old videos folder. So if you get lost, watch this.